In the 1990s, the barriers to starting a company were significant. Not only did you need an idea, you needed $200,000 for servers and Oracle licenses. With cloud computing, the upfront financial costs of getting a company off the ground have been mostly eliminated, but the idea of starting a company is still perceived as risky. The process of building software has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. But many of the challenges of managing a software company remain timeless. How do you hire properly? How do you keep track of a software stack that is growing in complexity? How do you handle dissenting opinions from employees? Mike Wolfe has been building software companies since the 1990s and joins the show to discuss how to build products and manage engineering teams and what has changed since the 90s. It's a wide-ranging discussion including technological trends, interpersonal skills, and startup financing. And before we get started with the show, I want to mention that the Software Engineering Daily meetup is happening January 11th in San Francisco at Galvanize. I hope you can make it, and if you're interested in finding out more about this meetup, you can check it out on softwareengineeringdaily.com or going to the Software Engineering Daily meetup page. With that, let's get on with this episode. Every software project uses email. Every time an e-commerce site processes a transaction or a user makes a comment on a social network, email notifications are sent. SparkPost provides email delivery services for apps and websites. To try SparkPost and send 100,000 emails a month for free, go to pages.sparkpost.com/sedaily. SparkPost has a range of pricing options, from free self-service packages to sophisticated enterprise support and services. Start sending emails to your users today. Go to pages.sparkpost.com/sedaily to send 100,000 emails a month for free. Thanks to SparkPost for being a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. And if you want to send 100,000 emails a month for free, go to pages.sparkpost.com/sedaily. Michael Wolfe is a computer scientist who has started several companies. Michael, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Thank you.
Most of the people who listen to this show are software engineers who work for somebody, and many of them would like to start a company someday, but they're not at that point right now. How should an engineer in this position strategize about putting themselves in a position where they can eventually start a company?
Yeah, well, I think there's probably two or three pieces to that. I think one is, I think very few companies are started without co-founders or without a set of early hires or without kind of a posse, without sort of a group of people who are going to be those people who make that company happen. So I think the first is to always be thinking about, first of all, are you working at a place where you're meeting people like that? Are you working at a company, or are you maybe doing some side projects or hobbies where you're kind of developing a network of people who you would either like to found a company or work with? That often happens if you work at a startup, because a lot of people who work at a startup are the kind of people who want to start a company, but not necessarily. There's groups inside of Google, groups inside of Facebook, and bigger companies where you also can meet a lot of entrepreneurial people. You just want to get yourself into one of those environments. And then I think the second is to always it really does come down to skill set. I think that when you get outside of a big company and when you're doing your own company, there's nowhere to hide. You just have to be good at what you're doing. You have to, if you're running engineering, you have to be great at engineering. If you are in a B2B business, you have to be really good at sales and marketing. And you want to get yourself into situations in your company where you get to actually develop those skills, because once you're out of that company, it's really just up to you to drive those things, and there's nowhere to hide at a small company. So the better you are at just those core functions, the better off you're going to be.
Path was fairly gradual in terms of going towards entrepreneurship. You didn't start off as a person starting companies. You started off as a developer in finance. You gradually took jobs in more managerial positions, and you eventually started a company in 2002. Do you wish you would have started companies earlier?
Well, this was back in the mid 90s. My first job was 1994. I worked for Goldman Sachs, so I was in finance for 3 years in New York and London. Then I came back to San Francisco, joined a startup as employee number 2, then joined another company, and I was Pretty much a co-founder of that company. I was the first person in engineering and ran the engineering department. That was Kana, which was 97 to 2001. And then I became a co-founder at Vontu, my third company, in 2002. And at that point, I'd already been an engineering manager, had already been a VP of engineering, had already been through an IPO. So I'd already had a lot of experience. I think at the time, it was a little bit harder to just graduate from college and jump in and start a company. This is back when, to start a company, you needed to know how to raise money. You needed to raise a lot of money up front, because that's back when you were hiring people. You had to hire a lot of sales and marketing and engineers just to get a B2B company started. This was before cloud computing, so you'd spend your first $100,000 on Oracle licenses and, Sun servers. So it was a little bit of a different era where it was a little bit more unusual and a little bit harder to start a company straight out of school. Plus, it was also just harder for anybody to raise money and to get going. There weren't as many sources of funding as there are today. So given the time, I wouldn't have done it any differently. And I think I also kind of like the idea of you kind of get better at things. So you don't try to start a company until you have some management experience. You don't try to run an engineering team until you have a little bit of engineering and engineering management experience. So it might be a fast career progression, but not a progression where you skip steps. Now, that being said, for somebody starting out today, I probably wouldn't say pay your dues and work your way up. I think the more experience you have, the better, and you don't want to jump into something where you're going to fail. But I don't believe in the idea that you have to do step A, step B, step C before you kind of have earned the right to start a company. And obviously history says a lot of people who, a lot of the best companies were started in college by people who obviously didn't have a ton of experience. So I really just think it's getting yourself in a situation where, given what you know how to do, given the company you want to start, given the idea that you're working on, and given the other people you can get around you, if those things align, I think there's never a reason not to start a company. I would never tell somebody, hey, wait until you get a little more experience in a particular area until you do. But for me, and at the time, it was the right path for me.
You and I were talking before the show about Amazon and how Amazon has been a really successful company. And Bezos didn't start that until he was, I think, 30. Yeah. And so certainly evidence that at least he is a fan of the apprenticeship approach. Mm-hmm. Of course, and Amazon has a very deliberate culture, although there are places like Facebook where it started, just out of college, and the disarray of Mark Zuckerberg's lack of experience resulted in a very unique culture that is not necessarily worse than Amazon's. It's just different. Yeah. But it's interesting how the apprenticeship phase can change how you end up approaching things as an entrepreneur. So, but with regard to the decreased cost, I talk about this a lot on Software Engineering Daily, the dramatically decreased cost. I don't think we've seen anything like this in history, where you have this startup cost that is initially $100,000, $200,000 just to get off the ground, just to get your MVP out there, and it goes down to effectively zero. Yeah. Do you think that the culture of the risk that it might take to start a company, has the conversation in our culture caught up to how easy and almost riskless it is to start a company? Are you surprised that there aren't more people starting companies?
There definitely has been, if you go back 10 years, a lot of it starts with AWS. There really has been an explosion, not just of entrepreneurs, but if you look at all the seed funds, all the incubators, all the angel investors who are coming out of the woodwork, a lot of that is an outcome of the fact that you can do more with less and you're getting more startup founders. So I think there has been an effect there. Now, that being said, there's always an equal and opposite reaction. So even though it's true that it's cheaper to get a company started than ever, there's also a lot more companies getting started, which means a lot of markets are going to have more competition than they would have otherwise. Also, the failure rate is probably not that much better because, again, lots and lots of companies going after similar ideas. The failure rate, if anything, has probably gone up because the lower the barriers to get started, probably the failure rate, at least in certain markets where there's lots of competition, has probably gone up. And the cost of actually, once you're past that startup phase and you're actually scaling and growing, that's as expensive or more expensive than ever. It costs a fortune to hire people and scale. So that's the part that really the costs have not gone down when you get to kind of that phase two. But I do think that people I think people overestimate the idea of risk. I mean, the risk in
downside risk.
Yeah, the downside. Like when I was growing up, my dad was in Vietnam. My grandfather worked in the coal mines. Like, risk meant you would die, or you would, or maybe you would lose your job and go on welfare or whatever. The risk right now is that your startup doesn't work, and you go do another startup, or you go get a job at Amazon or something. Like the risk reward. I think that the how attractive a large company job is and the stability of that. I think people are still living kind of a few decades in the past where that's kind of the default situation, especially parents kind of want their kids to get into. But I would actually argue that can, for certain people, that can actually be riskier than going and doing a series of startups. Because even if those startups fail, the experience you're getting and the network you're building, even going through some failed startups, has so much upside that I actually think that I don't actually see it. I see it as a more volatile lifestyle. You might be in and out of different projects at different times, but I actually don't think starting a company is riskier than almost any other path.
People are listening to this and they've already bought into that idea and they're like, yes, I want to start a company eventually. They want to go through the idea of vetting their ideas. They want to think about what company should they start. What are your pieces of advice on the ideation process, how people can think about ideas and start, like, what to start a company around?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, there's a great Paul Graham essay written about this, which is, it's something like how to get startup ideas. I think it's the definitive source of, information about this question. So if anybody, most people have probably read it. If they haven't, I recommend you look it up. It's great. Anything I say will probably be pale in comparison to the job that Paul did. But I think if you look at what he said and you look at just the companies that have succeeded, if you take some case studies, take Facebook, take Google, take the ones that have done well, they almost never come out of somebody saying, gee, starting a company is cool. I'm going to go look for an idea. I'm going to get a whiteboard, brainstorm 10 ideas, pick the best one, and go start a company on that idea. That sometimes works, but that tends to generate, first of all, ideas that are not unique or proprietary, or they end up being kind of ideas that anybody could have thought of. And a lot of times, a lot of people have thought of them, which means they're not very unique. That also tends to generate ideas that aren't really personal to you. You don't have personal kind of knowledge or insight or passion into that particular idea. It's just something that sounded plausible at the time. And I've been through this. I mean, I've made the mistake of starting companies around ideas that just were a result of a brainstorming session. Typically, the best ideas come out of some experience or passion or insight or some career path that a founder had. And kind of along the way, they said, wow, I'm sort of seeing this thing that nobody else has seen. I really want to make this happen. My goal in starting the company is to make this thing happen. My goal in starting the company is not that I just wanted to start a company and this was the best thing that came along. So I think getting yourself in situations where you may, if there's an industry you want to go into, maybe you work in that industry for a while. If you want to do something on the cutting edge of software, you probably work in a bunch of open source projects, or do something that's maybe something that's not happening at your workplace. You probably try to get yourself into a workplace where you're doing stuff that's on the edge. So if you want to do something in AI, you probably want to figure out a way to get into, either some academic or into some commercial projects in AI, for example. But I think you can't force it. You can't just decide, I am going to go brainstorm some ideas and pick something. I think they generally have to be an outgrowth of some experience you had or are having, which then kind of naturally leads to a startup as opposed to something where we try to force it.
When I'm choosing the tools for my side projects, the first thing that I look for is ease of use. That's why I love MongoDB. It is the most popular non-relational database, and it is super easy to use. At the beginning of a project, I often don't know the shape of my objects, and Mongo makes it easy to evolve the database schema as I like over time. Over time, as my project gets popular, I'm going to need to scale, and thankfully, MongoDB has built-in horizontal scalability, but configuration and database maintenance aren't really what I want to spend my time on. Thankfully, MongoDB Atlas was released in 2016. MongoDB Atlas is the easiest way to get access to MongoDB without having to run the database yourself. You pay only for what you use, from small projects all the way up to large production deployments. To try MongoDB Atlas today, go to mongodb.com/sedaily and get a free $25 in credit. Use promo code GOATLAS25 to get that $25 in free credit. Atlas is the only hosted MongoDB service built by the engineers behind the database, the company MongoDB. With Atlas, you get end-to-end encryption, you get VPC peering, you get access to the latest releases, and for a limited time, you can go to mongodb.com/sedaily, enter promo code GOATLAS25, and get that $25 in credit and get started with MongoDB Atlas. Thanks to MongoDB for being a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily, and thanks for being the database behind a lot of my favorite side projects in the past. We're really happy to have MongoDB as a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. So we've been talking about the preparatory phases of starting a company. The hardest part that I hear about once somebody has started a company is hiring. And when I was looking for jobs, I remember being so bitter about the hiring process and just feeling like as a software engineer coming out of college, the deck was stacked against me. This process is just horrible, bitterly resenting the whiteboarding problems that we had to do. But as I've kind of talked to a lot of people who are on the other side of things and they're trying to do hiring, they're just as frustrated. It's just as hard for them. What have you learned about hiring engineers?
First of all, I would say there's probably, thinking about startups specifically, there's probably three phases. One is just that co-founder phase. Who are those 2 or 3 people who are starting the company together? That tends to be people who you have some experience with. You either have worked with them, went to school with them, know them socially, and you have some background with them. And by the way, back to our previous topic, the question of the startup idea also doesn't have to come from you. It can come from your co-founder or somebody who you meet along the way. So that's also every company gets started kind of with its unique path that often leads to one founder having the idea and other people joining on. Then there's kind of phase 2, which is how do you hire those first 10 people? How do you get, when you go beyond the founders to the first 10? First of all, the more you treat them like co-founders and the less you treat them like employees, the better. So part of that means more equity. But a lot of that is not immediately establishing kind of that we're the managers, you're the staff, and we're going to treat you the same way that, say, a big company would hire you and treat you. It's more of a, hey, we're throwing a party. Do you want to come? And here's why it's cool. Maybe you're going to make less money, but you also have better upside on salary, maybe or on stock. Maybe you weren't there on day one, but there's going to be a whole bunch of work to get this idea off the ground. There's going to be some creativity. If it doesn't work, there might be a pivot. If you want to start a company someday, you're going to get a chance to be in that ideation, that early phase. Because, generally by the time you start hiring people, you don't completely have product market fit and have the product worked out. Then as you get to, say, 15, 20, 30, 40 people, you probably have raised some money at that point. You're probably paying something closer to market rate salaries, and you're probably hiring a little quicker. At that point, having a repeatable process where the way you source candidates, the way you do interviews, the way you make sure that every interview is a 50-50, where you're not just evaluating the candidate on can they do the job, you're making sure it's right for them, you're explaining the business to them, you're selling them, you're making sure it's a good fit. Having a process that is more kind of repeatable at that point becomes more important. And that process really has to be optimized around the question of why would someone come work for you and who should come work for you? How do I figure out when I interview people, are we a good fit for the stage we're in? Are we a good fit for the technology? Are we a good cultural fit? Do we give the candidate a ton of opportunity to ask questions and to dig deep? Do we give them a product demo? Do I show them our fundraising pitch? Do you really do the things that's almost, it's not a company evaluating the candidate, it's almost more of a matchmaking, like a dating exercise, where you treat the candidate with enough respect to say, hey, if you're somebody we want to hire, that means we need to sell you a little bit and we need to tell you a lot about us. We need to expose to you what we're doing, and really optimizing your process around making sure that happens.
With hiring comes the discussion of retention, and I think much of that is about culture. And company culture can attract people that you want. It can repel people that you don't want. Some people refer to culture as the things that you do. Other people refer to culture as the things that you don't do. How does culture at a company manifest in your experience? And what is the importance of culture?
Yeah, culture is something that you'll hear a dozen definitions of it. People have a lot of trouble pinning down exactly what it means. I think I'm one of those people who thinks that the way you determine your culture is by what people do. How do people spend their time? Especially how do they spend their time when they're working on stuff you didn't tell them to do directly as managers? It's what do people prioritize? What do people think is more important than other things? What do people, especially when, if you're not in town, people have to figure out, what do we work on today? What do we prioritize? I think it's so unless culture, culture is not the foosball table and it's not the happy hour. Culture is, are people there for the same reasons? Do they prioritize the same things? And I think that cultures evolve. You can't completely you can't completely go to a company and say this is our culture, because ultimately the culture is an outgrowth of who you hire and what you do. But I do think that, especially with the recruiting process, you can be very clear about the culture you want to build. And I think you don't have a culture unless it attracts certain people and repels certain people. So for example, our culture at my new company, very customer focused. Everybody should care about customers, want to talk to customers, want to help customers, want to even go visit customers and spend time there. Very agile around, we're going to keep replanning the product backlog and even the budgeting and the planning of the company around what's important today. So if somebody doesn't like having lots of replanning or lots of changes in plans, it might not be a good culture. We tend to value communication and teamwork. So we all sit in an open room together. We have a weekly meeting where we talk about everything happening at the company. We put all of our documents on a big, we use Quip, which is, it's kind of a Google Docs competitor, where it's very easy to see what everybody else is working on. So it's very transparent and open. There's a bunch of upsides to that culture. There's also a bunch of downsides. And when you decide you're going to have a culture, you're really saying that for this business and for this set of people, those upsides and those downsides are the right ones for us. But if you do interview somebody who says, hey, I don't like the way your office is set up, or I don't like spending time with customers, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that they might not be right for your culture. So I think you don't have a culture. If you have a culture that appeals to everybody, it means you don't have a culture. I think if you're clear on who the people who are going to succeed are and who the ones who aren't going to succeed, that probably means you at least have a point of view on what you're trying to build.
What have you learned about the ongoing management process of engineers? Once you have an engineer who is hired at the company, what have you learned about managing them, and what should an engineer be looking for in a good manager?
Yeah, that's a very broad, there's a million things I could say on the topic. I think I'll probably boil it. I think there's probably 2 or 3 principles that I think it usually kind of comes down to. I think one is that good engineering management is really people management. It's really, why did this person join the company? What do they want to learn? How do they want their career to develop? What do they want to do after they leave the company? And are we doing the things to teach them and get them where they want? Good engineers, they want progression. They want to be able to say, a year from now, I can do a whole bunch of things that I couldn't do when I started here. It might be technical skills. It might be business skills. It might be industry knowledge. It might be network. So I think you always have to look at, do I understand who this person is, where they want to go, and am I spending my time as a manager exposing them to different projects, different people, different situations, maybe training to make sure they're getting there. I think especially right now with kind of this generation, it's really less about salary and it's less about title, even though you have to make sure those things are aligned. It's more about, am I making rapid progression in my career? And if I'm at a company where I'm not, maybe I'll go find someplace where I am. Part of why I like startups is because startups are usually, the ones that are working are growing quickly. A company that's growing creates a bunch of new opportunity for people. So it makes it far easier to manage people because new opportunities are always emerging. Where if your company is flat, it becomes a lot harder. Somebody has to leave sometimes for somebody to get a promotion or get a new project. So that's one thing. I think the second is, every business is there for a reason. There's a particular customer you're going after. you're trying to generate certain revenue, you're trying to solve certain problems with those customers. The more you align people with that problem, for example, the more that engineers are not just thinking about the code they're writing, but the more they're thinking about, is our product selling? If it is selling, why is it selling? If it's not selling, what are the things we need to fix? Maybe I'll get on the phone with a customer so I can better understand that customer. Or maybe I'll work with the sales and marketing teams, find a way to get on a project with them so I can get more firsthand experience. I think you want to, first of all, you want to offer those opportunities to people. And I think you also want to find engineers who are looking for those opportunities, because then you end up with a culture where everybody's thinking about the same thing. It's how do I close the deal, or how do I get more users, or how do I make users more successful? And that, again, I think not only makes it, I think, easier to manage people because you're all pulling the same direction. It also goes back to that culture discussion we had, where if those are the kind of people you want on the team, then you make sure that when you do your recruiting and when you try to keep people, you target people who kind of have those skills.
What about the VP of engineering or the CTO role? How do you hire for that? And what should the responsibilities of a good VP of engineering or CTO be?
Yeah, it's a hard position to hire for. That's why so many startups have a technical co-founder who ends up growing with the company and stays in that role. However, there are times you hire that person from the outside, especially when the initial technical founder is not the person who wants to manage a big engineering team. I think generally, when you start a company, the person who runs the technical team is probably pretty hands-on. They might be coding the product, or at least be very close to it and kind of managing the direct development. I would say that when you get to, maybe it's 5 or 10 engineers, when you've raised a Series A, when the company grows, you still want somebody who is technical, who understands software, who's built software, who understands engineers. But it really starts to become almost purely a management role. I mean, a VP of engineering can spend a third of their time just recruiting, and they can spend a bunch more time with customers and managing their team and doing kind of external kind of industry stuff. So I think that the player coach model, where the person running engineering is also doing hands-on work on the product, works if you have a technical co-founder and you're probably up to 5 or 10 engineers. After that, that person has to either want to move into a pure management role, or that's where you have to hire somebody from the outside. And hiring somebody from the outside, it does work. A lot of startups do that, and it ends up working well. It's hard to do, though. It's usually better if you have a co-founder who can grow into the role as the company grows.
We've been talking a lot about running an engineering company from the point of view of hiring and managing people. Can you tell me about a time when there was a really hard engineering problem at one of the companies you were managing, where there was complexities maybe in terms of both managing people and figuring out a highly technical solution to a problem?
Yeah, I think that most, at least the products I've worked on, there's always been challenges around, how do you make the system scale? How do you make a user interface which is simple enough that a customer can understand it, but powerful enough that it does what you need it to do? We did the last company, we did some pretty complex stuff around recognizing patterns of data and looking for confidential data, which required a bunch of search and kind of pattern matching technology. So there's been individual technical problems that I found difficult to solve. I think the ones that in practice are probably the most difficult when you're running an engineering team are things that require trade-offs, things that require, we can spend the next couple months working on scaling the product, or we can spend the next couple months working on adding some features to the product, some of which might even hurt our ability to scale. Because those are those are hard technical problems, but they also kind of tie into which of our business priorities are we going to focus on? Are we going to, for example, focus on closing new deals or making existing customers happy? Are we going to focus on making the product higher quality so customers stop complaining about bugs or about problems? Or are we going to focus on landing that new set of customers, which means maybe adding features and not addressing quality? So for me, the trade-offs, which tend to suck in the whole company. You tend to even have individual sales reps who say, I'd rather you guys solve these problems. I'd rather you solve these other problems. Those are the ones that I tend to find more difficult. I think that if you have a great set of engineers, unless you're doing something really advanced, kind of on the bleeding edge of AI or drug discovery or whatever your particular industry is, if you have the right people and they have the mandate to solve those problems, they tend to get solved. What I find more difficult is the trade-offs. It's if I solve problem A, I'm probably not solving problem B. And that's where having a plan for the company where you're really clear on what are the priorities, what kinds of customers are we going after, are we going to focus more on new business or retaining existing business, making sure that the company has those trade-offs in mind or has decided on those trade-offs, then makes it a lot easier for the product teams to fall in line behind them.
My sense is that world where you can think more about trade-offs and think about end-user features is more of a recent development. Like if you think back to 1992 or 1995, around that time, you really did have to think about real technical problems, regardless of what industry you're in. But today, you can just pick up something off the shelf on AWS's 3,000 features they have available, or you can pick up an open source project and it solves all your problems, and there's a really long README and there's 15 supporting documents about how you can select from its competitors. Is that accurate? Is this a more recent development? Where
I would say that, what happens is that, and this is not recent. It's always been the case that the layers of abstraction with software continue to go higher and higher, and your work and your innovation happens at the layers above them. So things like how do I manage a big search index? How do I manage a database? How do I spin up a bunch of servers when I need to scale? There's still work in those because there's still trade-offs and things you have to do. But some of those have been mostly provided by the platforms. But however, all your competitors are using that same platform. So there's still, it gets easier in terms of, not easier, you're solving different problems. You're maybe not solving some problems lower on the stack. But the problem is that really raises the bar for the problems higher on the stack. All your competitors are working off the same platform. So instead of competing on, can I get some servers installed and running, and can I manage an Oracle database, which is what we were worried about back in the 90s. It's a great user experience. It's working great on mobile. It's being able to rapidly add a bunch of capacity quickly if a new customer comes online. It's the whole onboarding process and making that really slick. So you tend to start to compete among different dimensions, and some of them are a little more usability and kind of user facing, especially with enterprise and consumer stuff. But there's typically, if you're solving a problem that's hard enough to be worth solving, you end up, there's still a bunch of stuff with analytics. There's usually some machine learning you need to do. There's managing giant data sets. Those things still are hard. There's very few software products that are easy enough to build that just anybody can build them. And a team that you're always competing against companies that are in the same market you're in. So having a better engineering team, even if that team isn't uniquely able to solve certain problems, is probably going to innovate twice as quickly with better quality. So the engineering skill set still ends up mattering a lot, but you end up putting those skills into different part of the stack.
As those abstractions have changed and you've had to deal with different things over the course of your career, have you found that you've had to actively keep up with stuff, or have you just found that trial by fire has led you to keeping up with the topics that you need to stay on the cutting edge?
I think you need to actively keep up. I think you need to always be just keeping, looking at stuff that's coming out. You need to always read. You need to always look at open source projects. You always need to pay attention to what Amazon or Microsoft or any of the platform vendors are releasing. Because what ends up happening is, especially if you have, like our team, we have a lot of folks who are straight out of school. We have a lot of folks on our team now who are in their 30s and 40s. Now, those folks are just as current as somebody who's in the industry for the first time, because they've been at companies that have always used the latest and greatest, and they've always made an effort to be in companies that use the latest and greatest. When if you're at a startup, you have usually more opportunities to do that. And you have to be really curious about the industry. You have to always be looking for, is there a better way to do something? Are there new tools available? But you have to go into it with that mindset. I think that if your mindset is, hey, what worked at my last company is good enough to work at this company because I know it and I know it works, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Too much of that it really can create that problem where somebody who has more experience often, even if they're better at the engineering part of their job, because they're, for example, maybe not as willing to use certain libraries or certain platforms to solve problems, can end up moving slower than a team of people who kind of grew up in the era of, your first your first option is always to find something else that you can leverage as opposed to building it yourself. So you do have to make a conscious effort, and you have to really be careful you don't, as you get older, that you don't slip into, hey, I already know how to do that, so there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Because often there is a need to reinvent the wheel because the new wheel turns out to be 5 times faster and cheaper than the way you did it in the last company.
You mentioned the word competition several times in your answer a couple questions ago. Bezos of Amazon has always talked about how he thinks that it's better to be not to be competitor focused. You don't think about competitors as much. Peter Thiel wrote about this a lot in 0 to 1. He talked about competition just being, toxic. When is it helpful to think about competitors, and when is it helpful to be more inward looking and to just look at customers in terms of building a business?
I think that what Peter Thiel was saying is that I think that there's a temptation, especially I think kind of people who are high achievers and have spent their lives trying to get good grades, go to good universities, to measure what you're doing by what other people are doing and trying to do it better than they are. Like think about let's say that you want to play the piano, you go to music school and you try to be the best pianist out of 100 people who are at that school. And I think I agree that especially in the technology industry where there's a completely new business opportunity every day because the platforms keep changing, that going and trying to be a little bit better at something than especially established companies is really very few successful companies get started that way. Most successful companies are doing something that's kind of a greenfield or something new or something that nobody's doing. So in terms of how a company gets started, I think looking to do things a little better than the competitors is not a great way to start a company. However, if you see a big market where you can do something 10x better because you're leveraging a whole new platform or business model and it's disruptive, that is a good way to do it. Once you get into it, though, Amazon has a ton of competitors. They have Walmart, they have Best Buy, they have competitors overseas. At that point, you are in a market where innovating faster, having happier customers, hiring a better team is why you win. And it's why there's a bunch of folks who've tried to compete against Amazon who haven't won. That being said, the day-to-day of how you run the company, it's tempting to make your plans based on what competitors are doing. And it's always tempting to think the competitors are bigger and scarier than they actually are. And generally, you overestimate competitors more than underestimating them. If you spend your time obsessing about your customers and your products, and competitors are only important to the degree that your customers are telling you what they like and don't like about them, or you can learn from what's working and not working. Generally, you want to focus about 90% on your customers and your business, where competitors are just some data points out there that may or may not make you smarter. If they do make you smarter, if you do see something they're doing that maybe you should adopt or that you shouldn't adopt, you should pay attention to it. But generally, I think that people default, there's probably something in our limbic brain where we kind of over-index on what competitors are doing, which then gets you in kind of a defensive and reactive mode at a company. And my attitude is if the competitors are doing something great, we'll hear about it via our customers, but we're probably not just going to react because a competitor announced something or launched something that looks like it might be important to us.
So another thing I read in Thiel's work, and maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't, is that there is something about the working in a company that gets at some of the primal aspects of human nature. So he talks a lot about you want to build your early company like it's a cult, and something is somehow related to the tribalism that we naturally assemble into as humans. Another thing is he talks about scapegoats. He talks about these things that are deeply embedded in human nature and talks about them as being really crucial to how you think about business and how you think about companies. What do you find that to be true? Do you find like the more brutal aspects of human nature to occasionally be exposed in business?
There's a reason why small companies beat big companies, and this isn't just in the tech industry. You can go back hundreds of years and find that. Every big company today started out as a small company, and they started out as a small company that was probably competing against incumbents. And you have a few advantages. One is that you can do something disruptive with a new platform or a new business model or something that's hard for competitors to react to. But the other advantage you have at a startup is that you can put together a team of 5 or 10 or 20 people that is way more productive than what a big company can put together. Not necessarily because those people are more talented individually, but because you do have that kind of cultishness of a set of people who are completely focused on a problem, very devoted to each other, have a little bit of a monoculture in terms of all wanting to go after the same thing. So that piece I agree with. That being said, I think that what those people should have in common is a real desire to solve a particular problem, to win, to build a successful company. So you probably don't want a lot of diversity in terms of why you're there and what you're trying to accomplish. But in terms of who you have on the team, where they came from, why they joined, what their backgrounds are, that's where you do want diversity, because you want a bunch of different points of view that are all focused around solving the same problem. What you don't want is a bunch of people who all came there to solve different problems. And so I think that you want unity in the why you're there, what you want to do, how you like to work, but you want diversity in how you go about it. And I think they're a little different, and I think you need both.
Have there been times at a company where in an early company where dissent has been really toxic, or have there been mostly times where dissent you found has been really helpful? I mean, how do you think about dissent in an early company?
I've been pretty lucky because most of my companies haven't had too many of those really kind of fork in the road moments where if you go one direction, you're going to lose a bunch of the team. And if you go another direction, you're going to lose the other part of the team. That can definitely happen, especially if you have a pivot or some difficult situation. I think that you always want to be on the lookout for what I just talked about in terms of the cultishness. Let's all get together, have a common enemy, a common goal. Let's all kind of try to win. That can create a focus that then discourages dissent, where people fear that if they dissent in how you want to solve problems, it'll be interpreted as dissent of why are we even here, or do I belong on this team? So you almost you need to send signals that you want dissent around how to do things and the best way to solve the problem. And managers often human nature, I think, is to say, great, now I got a bunch of extra work to do because this person dissented and I have to go talk to them and I have to go talk to other people and I have to resolve a conflict. It's tempting as a manager to discourage dissent because it kind of makes your day-to-day life easier. If you do that extra bit of work to say, okay, let's figure this out. Maybe we're wrong. Maybe there's a different way to look at it. Maybe that dissent is evidence that we haven't communicated something or we haven't made a decision. And maybe the management team has to go back and say, where are we sending mixed signals? Maybe the dissent really is evidence that you have people on the team who really want to do different things. And that's okay. The better you resolve that, the earlier you find that out, the better off you are. So I think you always have to send signals that you want dissent, and you need to actively manage the dissent. If the dissent is really around values, or it's really around big stuff in terms of like what should the company even be, what problems should they even be focused on, those are the ones that are harder to resolve. And those are the ones where you probably end up with some people leaving or the company not working.
Software Engineering Daily has 20,000 engineers listening Monday through Friday. If you are hiring, or if you have a product that you would like to get into the hands of engineers, send me an email, jeff@softwareengineeringdaily.com. This podcast is sustained by the advertisers, and if you would like to become one, or even if you're just curious and you want to learn more, send me an email, jeff@softwareengineeringdaily.com. Thanks for listening. Zooming out, there is kind of a confused discussion around whether we are in some sort of boom-bust cycle or if we are in a never-ending growth period, or what exactly is going on, because people look at 1999 and they say, okay, that was an inevitable bust, and now we're on the uptick and there's just going to be some bust eventually, except we've been saying that for 2 or 3 years, and there's strong fundamentals that would say, okay, we've got plenty of gas left in the tank in terms of growth. Like if you just look at cloud computing and on the supply side, you look at mobile on the demand side, and you see, wow, these are two twin forces that have plenty of gas left in the tank. But then you hear plenty of narratives from people who are investing in tech companies, even in early stage and mid stage, and they'll say winter is coming, there's some kind of downturn that's going to happen that's going to impact all these markets. But it's hard to imagine fundamental forces that could push us in those directions. Yeah. It's mainly more financial forces. So do you think, what's going on there? Is there a cyclical...
I'd probably say there's probably three ways I would break it down. I think the first two are really time frame. So in terms of, does there seem to be kind of a 6 or 7 year or 8 year boom bust cycle in tech where we had a downturn in 2000, another one in 2008? It's flattened out, I think, in 2015, 16, although we haven't had the crash that a lot of people thought we were going to have. I think that is happening, and that'll probably continue to happen. And the overall economy has a lot of those same attributes too, where we tend to go in cycles. I think what's more interesting is if you look at, if I'm graduating from college today and I'm saying this big boom of innovation that was kicked off with the web and then mobile and then cloud computing and then AI and then an Internet of Things, whatever is next, do I think that is a multi-decade boom in terms of 10 or 20 or 30 years from now, new companies will still be getting formed and maybe even more than they are today because the pace of change is going to be faster? That is absolutely something I would bet on. So I would say, are we in a 30, 40, 50 year cycle of more and more opportunities being born every day because the platforms keep developing? Yes. The other thing is when people have this discussion, I always wonder, my question is always like, why do you care? Mm-hmm. Meaning, if my decision to start a company is based on some assessment of a boom and bust cycle, as opposed to just, I got this thing I really want to do that I think is going to work, and I'm going to spend 5 or 10 years doing it, so it kind of doesn't matter how many cycles we have in the meantime. If that is enough to keep you from starting your company, then you probably shouldn't start your company. Or if I'm worried that if I start a company, 10 years from now, maybe there won't be as many good companies to start, well, who cares? I'm starting a company today. I don't know what's going to happen in 10 years. And if my alternative is to go work at Google and not start a company at all, like it's a weird trade-off to make. So, fortunately, because I'm not an investor, I don't have to think around kind of, should I make more investments in 2016 versus 2017 because maybe there'll be some kind of correction. As an entrepreneur, you can think more in 5 or 10 year cycles. And that really just comes down to, is the thing you're working on a great idea for the next 10 years? It doesn't really matter if the overall industry is working or not.
Do you have any conclusions about this ongoing discussion that's been happening about private markets versus public markets, and the private markets expanding, and there's like secondary markets, and then there's all kinds of stuff like angel lists, and what, as somebody who thinks about starting a company, how should that affect your thoughts about raising money and just the overall economics of starting a company?
There's really, if back when, I hate to sound so old, back when I was getting started, you really had the traditional Sandhill Road, Series A, Series B, Series C. You probably raised a few $1 million to get started. If it worked, you raised 5 or 10 more. The thing that's really changed is, first of all the stuff pre-Series A. So you have the incubators, you have angels, you have seed funds, you have like late seed funds, early seed funds, institutional seed. And then you have Kickstarter and all the crowdsourcing stuff. So it means that when you start a company, you want to, do what you need to do to get started, which probably is not trying to go raise a traditional round of venture capital from someone like Sequoia. It's probably going to be angel lists. It's probably going to be some angels. And so that has really changed the early stage. The thing that's also changed, though, is at the later stages, companies that used to be public are now, there's so many sources of private money now when you get up into the kind of in the late, kind of the late rounds, that you don't have to go public. You can continue to grow, as we've seen a lot of companies do. I honestly think that if you're starting a company today, you're not going to have to worry about that for 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years. And that's a great problem to have. The problem of, should I go public or should I raise a bunch of money from T. Rowe Price? I don't know what that's going to look like in 5 years. I suspect it won't be too different than it is today. And I think that as a founder, the more options you have, the better. The fact that you have a diverse source of funding. But I kind of don't think it matters that much if you're getting started today. I think what matters getting started today is what stage is my company? What's the minimum amount of money I can raise to get me kind of 18 months and 2 years to get to that next big milestone where I can do around, kind of at the next level. My attitude is kind of the more the merrier. I think the more sources of money there are for our founders, the better. As long as that money is disciplined and not just throwing money at competitors or making bad investments. But again, I think that all I care about for my company is where are we, how much money do we need, and is there a great investor out there who can help us get to the next level? It doesn't matter quite so much kind of what else is happening in the market.
You mentioned some trends, and certainly one trend that is on people's lips today is machine learning or AI. And what I find interesting about machine learning is it's kind of like mobile, where the tooling is getting really good, like mobile was when the iPhone first came out, and you have this whole new class of developers that comes around where they have, they had to get an expertise in iOS, and today maybe they have they're trying to get an expertise in scikit-learn or TensorFlow or some other machine learning framework. Does that change how you strategize about? So you're working on Gladly, which is a customer service company. Does that change how you strategize about hiring for the company, or is machine learning more something that you try to just keep an eye on? You'll develop an expertise later on when you have the data and the volume. And
yeah, I think that I mean generally there's the problems you're solving for users, and then there's the platforms that you're using to solve them. And I think that for us, it's going to be, can we make companies more efficient? Can we help them support their customers? Can we help them make their customers more successful? So for us, machine learning is a tool and a platform we can use to do that. And that will probably require us having a few people on staff who are at least experts in how to use the tools and maybe have developed some of them. Some of whom we already have on staff. So for us, it's really, we have a mix of skills at the company. One of those skills is going to have to be machine learning, but we also have people who are great at user interfaces and people who are great at scale and people who are great at DevOps, and it's one of many. I think that what we're always looking at is, let's always work backwards from the problems that customers are solving. Machine learning is valuable to the degree that it helps them solve one of those problems, and to the degree that it might even transform the expectations and kind of how our industry runs. But it's kind of one of a few things that we're worried about right now.
Yeah, so I guess it's too early to think about, are we going to have a machine learning team, and what is the workflow going to be like between front end and back end and the machine learning team? Yeah,
but we definitely will, and it'll be a piece of what we're doing. But it will, if I had, let's say at the time we had 20 people on our team, I'd want a few people who were focused on it. I'd want everybody else to use it as an opportunity to just get more familiar with it. I want everybody to have a chance to leverage the fact that we had some machine learning projects, help them get smarter and more into the field. But what we're not going to do is say machine learning is the next big thing, so everybody we hire has to know something about machine learning, because we need a diversity of skills on the team. So that's going to be one important component, but it's one of probably 5 or 10 that we have to worry about.
Has that diversity of skill set thing always been important? Like in the past, was it like, oh, you have DBAs, you have QAs, you have software engineers, and then today you have DevOps, and then front end and back end, and maybe machine learning? Was the volume of different roles the same, or has there really been an do you feel like there's been an explosion in the diversity of roles and it's become more complex to put a team together?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't thought. I mean, back in the good old days, you were running your own data center. So you had people who were Unix sysadmins, Oracle admins, who were even like running the cables, and so you had a lot more expertise as required in the just on the operations side. In terms of the application, a lot, like for example, back in client server, you'd have Windows programmers that were completely disconnected from people working on the server. So you probably had, I would say, probably a little more specialization, or at least the differences in those skills were a little bigger. Where I feel like today, like we have a lot of full stack developers where they can do anything from the user experience all the way back to the back end and the persistence layer. And that gives you a bunch of flexibility as a startup, because your ability to spin up new projects, put different people on different things, form teams and rebuild teams goes way up if lots of people can work on different parts of the stack. So I'd say depends a lot on the application. I think if you're building a kind of a business application, the more you can get people who are flexible to work on multiple parts of the stack, the better. You'll probably still have some expertise. Ultimately, you will have some people in DevOps, because even if you have someone like Amazon doing your infrastructure, there's still a ton of projects there. You might have a couple people focused on security. You might have some focused on machine learning. As you get bigger, you do end up with a little more specialization, where there might be some people who are better at UI, some people who are better at more kind of systems or scale type projects. But, I think you always want to have kind of a mix of people who can work on anything. But as you get bigger, you do end up with a few teams that are a little more of a specialist skill set.
You and I were introduced by my former teacher, Mike Scott, and he was a very influential teacher to me. I think I took more classes with him than any student has taken with him, 4 classes. And one thing that was really distinctive about his a couple classes that I took with him was that I had a lot of freedom in what I was able to do and the projects I was able to work on. And there were most of the other classes I took in computer science were more, you learn X and then you regurgitate X in a very specific way. And those classes weren't a great fit for me, but the ones I took with Mike was just very valuable for me in building some confidence in my ability to think of an idea and build something from scratch. So that was really valuable for me. But it makes me wonder, what was computer science education like back when you were in school? And I mean, what aspects of it were more based on creativity, and what aspects were more based on kind of learning the theory that was pre-existent at the time?
I think that computer science, now I don't, I'm not a professor, so I don't have a complete map in my head of how the field has evolved.
Yeah.
But historically, it's kind of come out of math and maybe electrical engineering departments, and has been a little more, back like in the 80s, 90s, a little more theoretical, less of a focus on group projects and software engineering practices and things that actually go into building things. Like, for example, I did computer science for 5 years in school, really worked on very few group projects. I never learned anything about QA and the source code control. Open source wasn't even a thing that people talked about at the time. So I think it's evolved a lot. We're actually building things, actually creating things has become a much bigger part of the curriculum, which I think is great. There's always a tension where a lot of universities see themselves as academic institutions, not as trade schools. And they start to resist the idea that we are here to produce, for job training for software engineers. We're here to produce people who have a really solid kind of theoretical and academic foundation. That's a conflict, I think, in every academic field. I tend to be the pragmatist. I tend to think that, hey, we're going to graduate at some point, and your ability to produce things and create things for the world is kind of why we're here if you're a computer scientist or any kind of engineer. So I'm really in favor of what you're talking about, which is the theory is interesting, but if you're not actually creating something that a user is going to touch, or that's going to require a bunch of trade-offs around user interface and around performance and around kind of mobile versus web, then that's the stuff that is interesting and fun to me. So I'm glad to hear that Mike's doing that.
Yeah. Okay, so just to wrap up on that note of education, we were discussing boot camps a little bit before. Yeah. Since you're on the hiring side of things, what has been your assessment of when a boot camp graduate comes in the door? Yeah. Do they seem prepared for a job? Have you hired a lot of boot camp graduates? Do you feel like it's a adequate education? What's your assessment?
Yeah, I think it's all over the map, so it's hard to draw a conclusion. I mean, we actually do have some folks here who are fabulous who came through boot camps, but I also think we were not their first job post boot camp, so they had some other experiences in between. First of all, I think that we have a recruiting process where we do some pretty tough technical interviews. Now, we try to make them fun and not stressful, and we try not to do the whiteboard exercises too much. But I think that you don't want to be too biased toward, does somebody have a particular degree? Like, I think probably most of the people working for us do not have computer science degrees. Some of them have math degrees. Some of them were business. Some of them went through boot camps. So you want to design a recruiting process where you're really able to independently say how good is somebody, both based on their experience and based on some exercises. Not so, that's not just to make sure that you hire good people, but it's also, it lets you cast the net a lot wider. So, for example, if we only interview people who had computer science degrees, the potential set of people we could recruit would probably go down by 80%. Would also have less diversity in our pipeline. Would lose a lot of our best candidates. So we make sure we have a recruiting process which is fair. It's like they always say about symphony orchestras. They just stick people behind a curtain and tell them to play the instrument. And if they're good at playing,
heard that.
yeah, and if they're, first of all, it reduces all bias because you don't see them and you don't know how old they are, how young they are.
They really do that?
Yeah. That's considered kind of it's fair because you're not basing your assessment on what was their last job or where did they go to school, or there's no gender bias. It's just kind of, are they playing beautiful music? And if they are, you hire them. And I think that ultimately helps because it means that people who came into the field later, people who went through a boot camp, people who maybe learned to program as a hobby, but went to school with a different degree, some of those are the best developers we've hired because they're doing it kind of out of a natural curiosity. So I think boot camps are, if somebody's only experience was 3 months at a boot camp, I think it's unlikely that they're going to be able to jump in and work work on anything we have. It doesn't mean we couldn't bring them in and continue to train them on the job. I'd probably rather be somebody's second job after a boot camp than first job after a boot camp, unless that boot camp was supplemented by just lots of side projects and other things they may have worked on before the boot camp. So I kind of look at it as a aggregation of all their experiences. So boot camp might be one thing they did, but if they also had a history of tinkering and doing side projects and open source, that would be a big positive. There's also I think it's hard to be good at software unless you love software. So if somebody did a boot camp and they love it and they spend their spare time programming and they can't wait to get into it and it's what they want to do with their lives, that's somebody who, even if they lack experience today, they're going to progress really, really rapidly. If somebody just did it because they were trying to find a job and they read somewhere that boot camp was a good way to find a job, they're probably not going to have the passion or the interest to really get great at it. I think software, more than most fields, it kind of grabs certain people. You just say, wow, I really love doing this. It really feels right. And I think it's hard to be a good developer if you don't have that, if software hasn't grabbed you.
All right, Michael. Well, thanks for coming on Software Engineering Daily. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Really enjoy this.
Thank you.
Thanks to Symfano for sponsoring Software Engineering Daily. Symfano is a custom engineering shop where senior engineers tackle big tech challenges while learning from each other. Check it out at symphano.com/sedaily. That's SYMPHONO.com/sedaily. Thanks again, Symfano.